Let me give you a little background on. Everybody knows who Lily is. Uh, SEO extraordinaire by day, DJ or drummer by night. She always delivers value, whether it be SEO wisdom or some great beats. And I have become an aficionado of her live streams and Twitch streams. Love the music. I get a lot more done when she's pumping out her beats in the background. She's the senior director of SEO and head of organic research at AMSIP Digital, which some of us know previously as Path Interactive. Before that, she climbed from an SEO analyst to SEO director at Flying Point Digital. And before that, after she got her BA in politics from New York University, she was working for the New York City mayor's office, planning and organizing most aspects of various city mayoral events. So uh, you've gotten around a little bit, waiting to see when you cast your hat in the ring for some political office, Lily. But in the meantime, I'm very happy to be able to learn from you on a day by day basis
Well,
on
thank you.
SEO, and I love watching you present. And I've told you this before. You're a great speaker. Unlike me, I typically insert "us" about every fourth syllable. I have watched entire 1 hour presentations without a single from you. I don't know how you do it.
We'll see if I can do it today. Seems like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties with sharing my screen, so I might pop out and pop back in real quick. So just give me a second. Well,
Go ahead.
I
Give us an
I
idea
think
of what you.
yeah, I can just start talking about what I'll be talking about to keep us on schedule. Um, so I've been pulling a lot of data related to Google Discover. And maybe we can just dive right in and maybe skip the first few slides about what Google Discover is. I could just kind of talk through it. So Google Discover, for anybody that doesn't know, is a product that Google launched a few years ago, 2018. And it's basically a queryless search engine in a sense. It's just a form of curating a custom list of articles that Google believes that the Google user will find helpful. Based on a variety of different sources that they're pulling that information from. So it's also known as a highly personalized AI-driven feed of content from across the web. So the reason why I personally care so much about Google Discover, and if we can get the slides to work, I'm going to pull this up for you guys, but I did an analysis of a handful of different clients who, and not every client falls into this bucket for the record. There's plenty of clients that don't get traffic from Google Discover, but for those that do, it can be a massive opportunity from a traffic standpoint. So for a few of our clients, we actually have the majority of organic traffic coming from Google Discover compared to regular search. So in some cases, we have 63%, when you compare search and Discover together, 63% from Discover. In another case, 57% from Discover, 75% from Discover for another client. So,
Wow.
and we're talking, 50 to 100 million sessions in the past 16 months from Discover alone. So I think a lot of SEOs are in the habit of thinking it doesn't apply to them because they haven't seen traffic from it. Or maybe they think their sites don't apply because they're not publisher websites, they don't get Google News traffic or whatever the case may be. I would encourage you guys to reframe that thinking because we have a lot of clients that aren't publisher clients who just publish good content. In some cases, it's not even content. In some cases, it's like e-commerce category pages or product pages that show up in Google Discover. So really any site is technically eligible. You just have to know what it takes to appear there. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I guess we're still struggling to share the screen, so I'll just keep talking here. How does Google Discover source its content? So Google Discover looks at a variety of different data points that Google has access to, which, as you can imagine, the sky's the limit in terms of what Google has access to. And sometimes you'll see things in Discover where it's like, I don't know how Google got that information about me. It's kind of creepy, but they decided that this article will be helpful for me or valuable for me. And there's actually a way that you can go into your Google Discover settings and see your interests. And you can specify those interests so you can follow certain topics or unfollow certain topics, and they'll show more or less of that content. But if you don't do that, like I haven't done any of that, it just assumes what you're interested in based on your activity across all Google products. So, obviously how you search for things on Google, how you search for things on YouTube, perhaps how you use Gmail or other Google products. Your location history is really important. So if something is trending near you, for example, I'm in Costa Rica right now, I'm getting a lot of content in my Discover feed about Costa Rica, especially as it relates to like US travelers that are down here. So that's kind of interesting. And topics that you follow. So again, you can opt in or opt out to certain topics. If you see an entity appear in Google search that has a little plus sign next to it, so if you type for like a very high volume head term, something like, I don't know, healthcare or something, you're going to see a little plus sign where you can hit follow this topic, and that's a way of influencing what Google's going to show in its Discover feed for you. And I shared an example a few days ago that I thought was pretty interesting. So again, I just mentioned that Google will sometimes just pull what it thinks is important or interesting content for a user based on what they know about the user. And that's, again, like, who knows how Google's actually getting that information or what data points they're using. Hopefully they're not listening to our conversations, although I wouldn't put it past them. I looked through my own personal interests of what Google decided I'm interested in as it relates to my own personal Discover feed. And I thought it was very interesting. Most of them are really obvious. We have like SEO, traveling, DJing, whatever, coronavirus. And then at the bottom, it says crop top, which is a type of shirt that I wear a lot, but I don't search for it very often. I don't even go online and go on Google and say shop for crop tops or anything like that. It just decided that I'm interested in them. So that's kind of opens up a can of worms about how did Google get that information? And we had a little Twitter debate about it. And some people said, well, it's based on your shopping behavior. Like, for example, if you look in Gmail, you'll see some receipts from like Amazon or wherever where you bought a crop top. And so that's maybe a possibility, but I'm wondering if it's not because a lot of pictures of me have me in a crop top. And if you run those pictures, especially from my own knowledge graph, into Google's Vision AI tool, it actually says crop top as one of the main objects that it's identified in that image, which is terrifying. So potentially what's happening here is that Google is using image recognition, maybe, as it relates to entities in the knowledge graph to influence what people's perceived interests are in Google Discover. So it's mildly terrifying. And just checking in here, I assume we should keep going without the slides, right?
I see something up on your screen share portion of my monitor, but it's just a big blurry vision. I don't know what the image is, if that's your screen or...
It's not my screen.
Steve says it should be coming up shortly.
Got it. I will keep talking then for the sake of time. So one thing to note about crawling and how Google crawls content for Google Discover, it's very similar to how they now crawl content for Google News. Previously with Google News, you had to submit your site to the Google Publisher Center, and it was a manual process whether or not they approved your site for Google News based on a variety of factors that they considered. That changed, I want to say in 2019, where they've now opened it up to all sites. Google Discover works in the same way. So it's not only publisher websites, it's not only news websites, it's technically any site ever, unless you use robots.txt to block the site from being crawled by Google. That being said, there's no specific user agent, to my knowledge, that you can affect how robots.txt, parses your content specifically for Google Discover. I checked with Google about this. They don't necessarily have plans to do this. There's no index tag for Discover specifically. And we'll get into later why that's important, but it is important because it turns out that there seems to be certain traits of content that performs well in Google Discover that's quite different than how content performs in SEO. But unfortunately, Google doesn't give us tools to say, I want this to rank in Google Discover. I don't want this to rank in SEO, vice versa. Hopefully that's on the horizon one day because I do think it's going to ultimately come in handy for a lot of sites. There's one thing to caveat about eligibility for Google Discover. So there's a meta tag called Max Image Preview. It's Max Image Preview Large. This is in Google's documentation about ranking criteria for Google Discover. And basically what they say is that you have to include compelling high quality images in your content. especially large images that are more likely to generate clicks from Discover. So if you've seen a Discover feed, it's very visually oriented. It has very big thumbnails for the articles that it shows. And Google wants you to have an image on the page that's at least 1200 pixels wide. And you also must use that meta tag. So it's a meta tag that says max image preview large. If you're using Yoast, shout out to Yoast on WordPress, they add that by default. If you're not, you want to make sure that any page that you want to appear in Google Discover has that meta tag, because literally you're not eligible without it. Google needs that thumbnail to show up in Google Discover. So that's the one kind of criteria for appearing there. An alternative to that is you can use AMP, which takes care of that image requirement. It's just kind of baked into AMP. So either use AMP, add the meta tag, or you probably won't see any traffic from Discover. Where can you find Discover? Currently, it's only available on mobile devices. So it's native to Android devices. I believe it's just kind of built into the UX of Android. I don't actually use Android devices, but from what I understand, people that do are very heavy Discover users because it's front and center when you open up Google or open up Google search, you're going to see your Discover content right there. If you're like me and you use iOS or Apple devices, you have to use a mobile device. You can't use desktop, but you go into your Chrome app or your Google app, and you have to basically go to Google search, make sure you're logged in as yourself in Gmail, and then below the Google search bar, you can see a curated list of content. That's your Discover feed. And what does Google say about Google Discover? So they are a little bit elusive, like with many Google products, about how to appear there. And what's very interesting is that if you read Google's guidelines about ranking and Discover, number one, they emphasize EAT, which I talk about all the time, expertise, authority, and trust. They double down on that with newer articles about Discover, like make sure you have good EAT. They just say that over and over. They don't necessarily talk about what that means. It just means that if you're not appearing in Google Discover or Google News, it could be an EAT issue. Google doesn't perceive you or your business as having sufficient EAT to appear in these surfaces where, presumably EAT is very, very important with the news types of surfaces that Google offers, because Google is very focused on combating misinformation and fake news. So you need to have a certain level of EAT to be able to appear there. But then what's interesting about Google's documentation about Discover is that they talk a lot about clickbait, almost like in 3 or 4 different bullet points. They talk about why clickbait is not, it's really bad. It can get you basically eliminated from Google Discover. So they say use page titles that capture the essence of the content, but in a non-clickbait fashion. That's number one. They also say avoid tactics that artificially inflate engagement by using misleading or exaggerated details in the preview content, and make sure that you're not withholding crucial information from your headlines. And also to avoid tactics that manipulate appeal by catering to morbid curiosity, titillation, or outrage. And you should also be providing content that's timely for current interests, tells a story well, or provides unique insights. So what are they focused on? They're focused on unique content. They're focused on not having clickbait and Discover. And throughout today's talk, you're going to hear from me based on actual data of over 11,000 URLs that I've analyzed across over 70 sites. This does not appear to be true in practice. This is just what Google's saying in theory. So to me, that's pretty interesting. I don't know that Google necessarily understands how much traffic is going to sites that seem to be using a lot of these tactics in their headlines. We don't necessarily want them to take that away from us, but I do think it's one of those examples where maybe you take Google's recommendations with a grain of salt, because the data appears to be different than what Google's saying in practice. So another thing that Google says about ranking in Google Discover is the ranking criteria, which I'll just go over really quickly. Have a mobile-friendly website. Use unique and high-quality images. I think images are very, very important for Discover, maybe more so than other areas of your site. Again, you want to have it be 1,200 pixels or more, so make sure that it's a very high-quality image, ideally a unique image. You want your metadata and your content to be aligned. Publishing about popular topics is really important, so making sure that you're publishing something that people really care about. We'll talk about that later as well. Again, work on your EAT, focus on entities. So same advice we would give any news publisher, just make sure that it's very clear what entities you're focusing on, both in the headline as well as in the body of the content. You know, with Google News, we often see like having an entity close to the beginning of the title or the headline as close as possible to the front is very effective. And that's just been like a best practice in journalism for a long time. So I think that's true for Discover as well. Although we will see later that there's some ways to format your headlines for Discover specifically that tend to drive more traffic and higher click-through rates. Create buzz with your content distribution. I've seen this personally for my own content. If you produce a good piece of content and you put it on Twitter, you put it on Facebook or wherever it gets picked up, if it starts to get traffic from social media and visibility on social media, you might see it appear in Discover really quickly. I've seen an article that I published about a core update take off within a few hours of publishing it, and maybe 3 or 4 hours later, it was getting a lot of traffic from Google Discover. So I think if something's a really hot topic on an entity or a topic that people really care about, it has a good tendency to get a lot of traffic from Google Discover. That being said, it's very short-lived. For something like a Google Core Update, you might only see that traffic for maybe like 1 or 2 days from Discover. Make sure you periodically refresh your content. So one thing that's interesting is you don't need to only publish new newsworthy content to get traffic from Discover. You can actually sometimes see articles that are evergreen or that you've published a few years ago that are doing well there. So let's say you have a piece of content about taxes from last year that did really well in Google Discover. Maybe you should take that piece of content, update it for this year, and you might see that page start to get traffic again. Or in some cases, it's something that's purely evergreen. So like we have some pet clients. One example I use is an article called "Do Dogs Feel Love?" That did really well in Google Discover, regardless of when it was published. I think it was 3 or 4 years old. But if you're seeing that type of behavior, you probably want to go back into that article and update the timestamp and the content. Even if it's not much to update, you still don't necessarily want it to say that it's a few years old. Another thing to note here, and it sounds like at this point, I'll just be sending out the slides after the talk. So just keep talking through this here, bear with me. But web stories are really important. So for anybody that doesn't know, web stories is a visual format that Google launched, I want to say last year, maybe 2 years ago. And think of it as like Instagram stories or Facebook stories. It's a series of visual thumbnails that Google shows at the top of Google Discover and some other places in search. But it curates web stories that publishers have created, and it shows them on Google Discover. And that's a really great traffic source as well if you're able to make web stories. So for anybody that's unfamiliar, it's an AMP HTML blended type of document that shows the same way that a Facebook story or an Instagram story would appear. So it's very visual. But if you look at if you Google like CNN mobile stories, you'll see their entire page dedicated to web stories just for inspiration. And they're little visual cards that tell a story about something. So CNN, for example, had one about John F. Kennedy. Obviously not new news, but because it was such a visual story, they used web stories for that. And that definitely has the potential to appear in Google Discover for somebody that cares about that type of content. So as far as analyzing Discover performance goes, the only real place to look is Search Console. If you have Google Discover traffic, you're going to see a Discover tab appear under the performance report. If you don't have traffic from Discover, you won't see it there. So don't go crazy looking for it. It just means you don't have any traffic from Discover. But keep an eye on it, because if you do start to receive traffic from Discover, you'll see that thing appear. And it's helpful to an extent, but unfortunately, there's no API for Google Discover right now. So if you want to do what I'm doing and look at more than 1,000 URLs at a time, it's not super easy. It's not easy to link it with something like Supermetrics or one of these plugins that pull in data from Google Search Console, because you don't have the availability to see Discover content there. So I believe Google's working on that. That will be really helpful for us in the future. There's also no dedicated referrer source in Google Analytics for Discover. So unfortunately, you can't just go to Google Analytics and hit Discover as a traffic source. Wouldn't that be nice? It's blended from a variety of different places. So we have Discover traffic showing up in direct, organic, and then refer. And if you go into your refer traffic, you'll probably see something called googleapis.com, and that's pretty much your best bet for that's most likely all Discover traffic, but it's not the only place that Discover traffic appears. So just note that it's coming into a variety of different buckets. And I do want to call out this one discussion we've been having on Twitter the past couple of weeks, thanks to Valentine Pletzer, who's the man when it comes to Google Discover. He's just on top of everything. But Google launched a new product called Google News Showcase. And this is for a variety of different countries like Australia, I think maybe the UK. And it's a way for Google to pay publishers to display their content in Google News. That's the News Showcase. Looks like they're testing out how the News Showcase content appears in Google Analytics. For whatever reason, Google decided to use UTMs for this. They also decided in the process that the UTM, the medium for the News Showcase traffic, should be Discover. So just to muddy things even more and to make things even more confusing for most people, if you see medium equals Discover in your Google Analytics, that's not Google Discover traffic, that's Google News Showcase traffic. So we have some clients who saw like 10,000 sessions from quote unquote Google Discover for the one day that Google launched that back in August. And apparently today, again, this is happening. So just note that if you see Discover in Google Analytics, it's not Google Discover. It's most likely Google News Showcase. So that makes things even more confusing. And SEOs have been trying to figure out how to analyze Discover data since Discover became a thing. So Valentin, again, has a really great finding where he was able to look on the back end of the articles that are appearing in Google Discover, and there was something called a card category, which showed how Google was classifying a bunch of different content that appears in Discover. So we have like these kind of confusing or like I don't know, just hard to understand names for categories that Google created, like core panoptic story, COVID-19 entry points, fresh video, local lift stories. Like, it's not entirely clear what they mean by that, but that was just some internal naming convention that Google apparently assigned to their Discover content. This was written about, Ahrefs wrote about it, and I checked again this past weekend. Google actually took those away from us. So now if you look at the card category associated to Google Discover content, it's just a number. So unfortunately, our attempts at reverse engineering how Google's deciding what should show up in Google Discover are not working out so well. I think they're on to us. Anyway, I'm going to talk next about what I'm seeing with our own client data, which I think is going to be the most interesting part of this presentation, because again, Google's very focused on theoretically emphasizing EAT. It's very focused on reducing clickbait, making sure that headlines aren't provoking unnecessary emotion and not delivering on what the headline aims to achieve. They're actually starting to send out manual actions. So one thing to keep in mind is if you push the limit too far with clickbait, with not delivering what you're saying you're going to deliver as part of the headline, they can actually send a manual action. These manual actions don't, to my knowledge, I haven't seen one that affects the entire site. Maybe those exist. I actually maybe have heard some people saying you can see a serious traffic decline from Discover if you're affected by these manual actions. I haven't seen that yet. I have seen some that flag individual URLs. So that's if a URL violates any of the guidelines that Google lays out, which they have a new document that talks about manual actions related to Google Discover. One of them is definitely about clickbait. The rest are about basically lack of EAT or anything that's offensive content, harmful content, violent content, things that contradict scientific or medical consensus. A lot of the same guidelines that you would see related to any content where Google's emphasizing EAT. So for my process, again, I looked at 12,142 URLs from 76 websites that I have access to that are receiving Discover traffic. One thing to note is in terms of headline length and word count, which I think people are always asking about, for the articles that received over 500,000 clicks in the past 16 months, the average word count was 17 words. So 17-word headlines tend to perform well. The average word count of the article itself was 740 words. I also cross-referenced this with articles with a high click-through rate in Discover. So anything with over a 25% click-through rate in Discover, the average headline word count was 12 words, and the average article word count was 816 words. So I know you guys can't see the slides, but just to summarize that, between 12 and 17 words in the headline saw the best performance, between 740 and 816 words as the article length saw the best performance in Discover. So it's important to remember word counts are not ranking factors, but those are just correlations between 12 and 17 words for headlines, 740 to 816 words for articles. Do with that what you will. Now, as far as the findings go, so finding number one is that Discover content tends to be highly, highly emotional. Some examples of content, and I'm going to do this without giving away who my clients are, just going to talk about some of the general topics that the clients wrote about. Articles that saw over a 25% click-through rate in Google Discover. We have a church pastor who was cheating. That was a scandal that kind of kept going on and on. That got a ton of click-through rate, very high click-through rate. We have X-rated symbols appearing in children's movies, celebrities filing for divorce, celebrities having angry meltdowns, deaths of political figures, celebrities firing people. It tends to get a lot of traffic. Anything with observations about celebrities' bodies tends to do very well. Scandalous photos, drug use statistics, or very relatable relationship advice. So if you could see the slide, you'd see a bunch of tabloids, picture of a bunch of tabloids, because essentially what you would expect to see in a tabloid, from what I'm seeing in the data, is very similar to what's performing well in Google Discover, despite what Google says should rank there. Some of the words that are used in the top performing Discover headlines, we have X-rated, swaggy, serving up thick thighs, tragically died, tea steaming, sent a terrifying message, things you should never buy, he's free of his baby mamas, getting rattled, birthday bae, inside the love triangle. So again, almost tabloid type content is doing very well in Discover. Another finding is that straight up clickbait seems to work really well in Google Discover. So these are some of the word structures and headlines that performed really well. So this heartbreaking moment, call out the hypocrisy. Articles with huge amounts of money do really well. So we have 30 million, 300 million, 228 million. Then we have summed up in this one word, called out this rapper, threw up in the streets, under this one condition, reveals her real hair color, demanded this one major change, why you need to sell XYZ immediately, and this one massive problem. So it's basically the word structures you would expect to see with pretty clickbaity type of content. So I'm not advocating that you guys go write clickbait by any means. And I do want to caveat this by saying that you can receive manual actions if you take this too far. What I would do is try to find a balance between writing headlines that generate good click-through rates for Discover based on this information, but also making sure that the article content has the actual content that the user's looking for front and center at the beginning of the article, because you want to avoid those manual actions. They can be very hard to recover from. So another thing is that what works best in Discover might not work best in SEO. I find this part really, really interesting. Some examples of content that perform extremely well in Discover but have no traffic whatsoever from search. We have a lot of drama around Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. We have Shaquille O'Neal's child from a high school girlfriend. We have celebrity couples getting divorced. The Little House on the Prairie star meeting her birth father. The various faces of Northwest, Kanye West's daughter. Supplements that lower your blood sugar, which I think is really interesting because that same article, that same site has no traffic at all from search. And that's a your money, your life topic. That's a health topic. So it appears to be the case that sometimes you can appear in Google Discover and drive traffic from Google Discover for topics that might be off limits to you from an SEO standpoint. Now, on the flip side, I flipped it around and looked at stuff that's performing really well in search, but not Discover. And the real takeaway here is that entities and topics that people tend to search for, obviously for SEO, aren't always the things that show up and do really well in Google Discover. So like how to print your iPhone photos, how to read a pay stub, federal versus state taxes, what to know about IRAs. Maybe these aren't the most fun and interesting topics, but people are searching for them. So they do a lot better in SEO than they do for Discover. And again, real quick, I just want to talk about some forbidden topics that are performing very well in Discover for some of our clients, but that they have absolutely no organic traffic for. So dangers of wearing a mask for COVID. George Floyd testing positive for COVID. Are vegetarians safe from COVID? COVID-19 protocols while on cruises. Does your diet cause acne? Omega-3s and life expectancy. Essential oils, CBD and heart health. And if you've seen me speak before, you've probably heard me talk about the fact that many of these are topics that most sites can't rank for in organic search because Google's so focused on EAT. And these are all your money, your life topics. However, these same sites that are not seemingly able to rank very well, maybe because of lack of EAT in search, are driving a lot of traffic from Google Discover for these same topics. So, you know, if your goal is traffic, maybe don't maybe focus on Discover for certain topics where Google has decided that you're not eligible to rank for search. And a few more slides here. So one example that I find really interesting is a pet client of ours, and just to look at the difference in traffic between SEO and Discover. So, they didn't write these articles with the intention of driving traffic from one or the other. It's just that Google kind of chose one for each place. So when it comes to what they perform well for in SEO, it's pet health and medicine, pet insurance, and pet food. When you look at what they're doing well for in Discover, ironically, it's a lot of the same content that I told them is never going to do well in search. And I've been telling them this since before Discover existed. But now that Discover exists, like these articles are doing really well. So we have Do Dogs Feel Love, Obscure Pet Illnesses, Dogs with Disabilities, Animals Overcoming Disease. And the reason why I said they weren't going to do well in SEO is because the way that this client or this company labels these articles is like, you'll never believe how Jojo the dog recovered from this obscure illness. And it's like, obviously no one's searching for Jojo the dog unless the dog's famous, which it's not. But that article got picked up in Google Discover and got a ton of traffic from Google Discover, presumably from people who have pets and love pets. So don't discount articles that don't do well in SEO because they might have a lot of potential to do well in Google Discover if they're highly emotional and engaging. Another observation is that posing questions as headlines does really well. So some examples are, does XYZ help with anxiety? Does XYZ movie contain X-rated content? Did Trump say XYZ? These are all headlines that drove very high click-through rates. Is this a photo of XYZ and this other person? How do you tighten your skin? Did XYZ person get a pay raise? So for better for worse, if you structure your articles as questions, that might drive higher click-through rates in Google Discover. So another thing too is just to think about people's interests. Again, like with pet content, if someone's really, really obsessed with dogs and you have a really like an article that tugs at their heartstrings and makes them feel a certain way about dogs, that is potentially good content for your audience in Discover. Other topics that have done really well, we have athletes going to jail, diabetes health, Trump shenanigans, COVID controversies, anything involving Wendy Williams drives tons of Discover traffic, government payments, police brutality, celebrity or athlete drama, stolen election. A lot of these topics that are very, very like have a lot of public interest also do very well there. So some takeaways. I do once again want to caveat that I'm not suggesting you violate Google's guidelines. Please don't do that. Please don't create clickbait for the sake of creating clickbait, but just think about some of the commonalities of the type of content that we're seeing, and I'll publish this deck so you guys can see it. The stuff that does really well in Discover because it's very different than SEO. So think of Discover as a separate additional organic traffic source. Discover drives unpaid organic traffic. So as an SEO professional, you can take credit for it. It's yours. It's more organic traffic that you can drive to the site, even though it's hard to find it in Google Analytics. Look in Google Search Console, report on that traffic. That's your traffic. But just remember that Discover behaves more like Facebook than regular organic search as we know it. And then maybe think about a blog strategy or a content strategy that simultaneously focuses on core SEO terms that people are searching for, doing traditional SEO processes where you're reverse engineering what people search for, picking the highest volume thing. That's fine for SEO. For Discover, maybe talk to your social media teams and see like what's doing really well on social, what types of headlines drive the most clicks on Facebook, because there seems to be a lot more commonality with that strategy for Discover than what we're used to with organic search. And I know a lot of people are going to ask me like, how can you do the same thing simultaneously on a piece of content, target SEO and Discover? There's no way to do it right now. There's no index tag, there's no robots.txt directive. So just think about maybe segmenting out your content. So some is used for Discover and some is used for regular search. And with that, thank you very much. I'm very deeply apologetic that my slides did not load. I'll share them on Twitter later today, and I believe Doc will be sharing them as well. So don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions, and I believe we still have some time for Q&A.
Yeah, well, the apology for the sharing is not on you. That's us/ViewStub. Don't know, bandwidth, internet connection, whatever, but it's certainly not on your end. Great stuff. Some of that was surprising to me too. Steve, I don't know if you can unmute. Do you see any questions in the Q&A?
Where's Steve?
He's waiting for his smoke signal.
We're all on third world Wi-Fi here.
Yep.
Do you have any questions, Doc?
You know, we were chasing details, so I didn't get a chance to pay as much attention as so I'm looking forward to going back through your talking and listening to it again and the slides as well. But no, I haven't paid enough attention to Discover, and even though you had mentioned it to me a couple of months ago, and I need to do that because I think there is some opportunity there. Some of the things that you said did surprise me, though. I really hope that they get around to making some of that tracking available to us in GA and GSC.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, I think SEOs don't even know that they can take credit for this right now. Like, if you're not looking in Google Search Console at your Discover tab, you might not even, if you're just like using Google Analytics and reporting on organic traffic, or maybe you're using something to report just Google Search Console organic traffic to your clients, and you're not incorporating Discover traffic manually, you're actually not reporting on an organic traffic source that I think you can take credit for, whether or not you intended for it to appear there. We have some clients where we do, like, now we're starting to think of Discover as a separate organic strategy.
Yeah. Well, frankly, if you had not mentioned it to me some time ago, I would not have even been aware it existed.
Do you have an iPhone or an Android or neither?
I do have an iPhone.
That's probably the issue, is that most people that use Discover very heavily are Android users. But if you talk to them, they're like, oh, I use it every day, all the time. It's like, it's very heavily weighted Android. But now that I know where it is on my iPhone, I use it very heavily as well.
I will definitely be checking it out. And I'm hearing nothing from Steve, so I guess that he's either having issues or there were no questions. Or he's muted. Oh,
well, anybody
he's
can
live
ping
because
me.
he just changed the display here.
Feel free to ping me on Twitter if anybody has any questions. It's Lily Ray NYC.